It's wild, isn't it? You look at all the stuff going on in the world, like Israel, Ukraine. It's heavy stuff.
Totally. It's like, where do you even start?
Yeah.
There's so much out there, so many opinions, and they're all over the place. It's tough for anyone to, like, really get a handle on what's actually going on.
Right. And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive.
Yeah.
We need to, like, break it down.
Exact.
And so today we are diving into a particularly interesting conversation. It's from the Joe Rogan Experience.
Okay.
Episode 2303.
2303.
So it's Joe Rogan. He's got Dave Smith and Douglas Murray on.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're going to get, like, a pretty diverse range of views then.
Exactly. And that's what makes this episode so interesting. It's long form, right? So they have time to really get into it, even when they disagree, which they do a lot.
I bet.
It can get pretty heated.
And that's what makes it good, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So our, like, mission here, right? It's not to tell you what to think. It's not to pick a side. We're not going to do that.
Okay, good. Because, like, that's not helpful.
Not at all. We're here to, like, figure out what these guys are saying, where they agree, where they disagree, you know? And most importantly, why? What's the logic behind it all?
That's the interesting part.
Exactly. Like, what are their arguments?
Yeah.
Right. So right off the bat, they start talking about guest selection and, like, bias on these kind of shows.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. And so Rogan gets asked, if he's had enough guests on who are, like, supportive of the wars, like in Israel and Ukraine.
Ah, so right there, there's already this assumption that, like, there's a pro-war and anti-war side, and you got to have both.
Right. And Rogan's response is super interesting. He basically says that he's leaning towards the idea that what Israel's been doing, he actually calls it barbaric.
Wow. Okay, so he's definitely not shying away from, like, taking a stance.
No, he's not. And that kind of sets the tone for the whole conversation, you know?
Yeah.
And then Douglas Murray jumps in and he expresses concern about people getting platformed who, in his words, are promoting counter-historical stuff of a very dangerous kind.
Uh-oh. That sounds intense. Like, what's he referring to?
He specifically mentions this guy, Daryl Cooper, and another guy, Ian Carolan, and their views on Churchill.
Churchill. Okay, so this is getting into, like, historical revisionism territory.
Big time. And this is where it gets really interesting. You know, this whole idea of, like, who's qualified to talk about history?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, do you need to be a historian, with all the degrees and stuff? Or can anyone have an opinion?
Exactly. And, like, Murray is pretty clear that he thinks experts should be the ones, driving these conversations.
Makes sense. I mean, they've dedicated their lives to studying this stuff, right?
Right. And he uses this example. He says, like, imagine a debate between this Andrew Roberts, who's, like, this big-time Churchill biographer, and Daryl Cooper.
Okay.
He's basically saying Roberts would wipe the floor with Cooper.
Probably.
Right.
I mean, expertise matters.
But then Dave Smith pushes back a little. He's like, hold on. Having an opinion doesn't require you to be an expert.
Right, right. I mean, we all have opinions on stuff we're not experts in.
Exactly. And he brings up Pat Buchanan, who's, pretty well known for his critical views on Churchill.
Okay. So he's using that as an example of someone who's not necessarily a historian, but still has, like, strong opinions on historical figures.
Right. And this leads to this whole back and forth about whether Buchanan actually qualifies as an expert and whether he's, like, really engaged with historians who disagree with him.
So they're basically debating the validity of different voices in this historical discussion.
Exactly. And, it gets to this bigger question, right? Like, in this age of podcasts and the internet and everything, everyone has a platform.
Yeah, everyone's an expert now.
Right. So, like, how do we navigate that?
It's tough. I mean, it's great that there's more access to information, but it also means there's more misinformation.
Exactly. And Murray is clearly worried about that. Like, he sees these non-expert voices as potentially undermining our understanding of history.
And not just any history, right? Like, we're talking about Churchill, Hitler, World War II. This is huge stuff.
Huge. And Murray doesn't mince words. He accuses Cooper and Carolan of, like, straight up downplaying Hitler while, like, unfairly criticizing Churchill.
Wow, he's really going after them.
Oh, yeah. And Smith tries to, like, soften that a bit. He suggests that maybe Cooper's just being provocative, like trying to get a reaction.
That's a good point. Like, sometimes people say things just to stir the pot.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally. But it raises this question, right? Like, when someone says something controversial, how do we know if they're serious or just, like, playing a part?
Yeah. And, like, what are the consequences if we get that wrong? Especially when we're talking about something as serious as, like, historical revisionism.
Exactly. And this leads them into a really interesting discussion about what Murray calls woke insanity and the right-wing reaction to it.
Okay, this is where things could get really messy.
Oh, yeah. So Murray is basically observing this trend where, like, some people on the right, they see what they consider to be, like, left-wing overreach.
Right.
And their reaction is to embrace, like, racialist ideas and even, like, flirt with Holocaust denial.
Oh, wow. That's really disturbing. So he's saying that, like, the left pushes too far in one direction and the right swings back even harder in the other direction.
Exactly, like a kind of reciprocal radicalization,
Yeah. And, like, no one wins in that situation. Everyone loses.
Right. But Smith pushes back a little here. He's like, hold on, I don't think Daryl Cooper fits into that category.
Okay, so he's making a distinction between, like, legitimate criticism and this more extreme stuff.
Right. But the conversation broadens out, and they start talking about how the left has historically downplayed atrocities committed by, like, Mao and Stalin.
Right, right. I mean, there's definitely been a tendency to, like, overlook or excuse the crimes of certain figures depending on your political leanings.
Exactly. And, like, they acknowledge that this isn't unique to one side of the political spectrum.
It's more like a human flaw, you know?
Yeah.
We tend to be more critical of the other side.
Right. And then they bring up this concept of audience capture, which is super fascinating.
Audience capture. Okay, I've never heard that before. What is that?
So they're talking about how, like, especially online, you can get trapped in this echo chamber where, like, you only hear from people who agree with you.
Yeah, and the algorithm feeds you more and more of that stuff.
Exactly. And they use the red pill analogy, from the Matrix.
Oh, right, right. Like, once you take the red pill, you see the world differently and there's no going back.
Yeah, and they're applying that to, like, how people get drawn into these increasingly extreme viewpoints.
And, like, once you're in that rabbit hole, it's hard to get out.
So true. And then the conversation shifts a bit to conspiracy theories and how ideas that were once considered, like, racist can actually gain traction over time.
Interesting. Like, what changes? How do those ideas become more accepted?
Well, they use the lab leak theory as an example.
Oh, right, right. That was, like, dismissed as a crazy conspiracy theory at first. And then, more people started taking it seriously.
Exactly. And, like, they're pointing to how the boundaries of what's considered acceptable discourse can shift.
And that can be, like, a good thing or a bad thing, right?
Totally. And Murray expresses concern that this trend could lead to, like, the questioning of some pretty well-established historical narratives.
Okay, like what?
He specifically mentions Churchill, Hitler, and the Holocaust.
So he's worried that, like, as people become more distrustful of mainstream information, they'll start to question, like, the basic facts of history.
Exactly. And for him, that's really dangerous. Like, he sees a direct link between questioning those narratives and potentially, like, excusing or minimizing past atrocities.
Yeah, that's a slippery slope for sure.
But Smith jumps in to clarify something about Cooper's statements on Hitler, specifically in the 1930s.
Okay, interesting.
He's basically saying that Cooper's point was about how Hitler, like, strategically downplayed his anti-Semitism during that period.
So not denying Hitler's anti-Semitism, but, like, pointing to a specific historical context where it was less overt.
Exactly. And Smith is trying to make a distinction between that kind of, like, specific historical observation and a broader attempt to, excuse or minimize Hitler's overall ideology and actions.
Yeah, I can see that. It's important to, like, consider the context of these statements.
Right. And then they move on to World War II and Churchill's legacy.
Okay, so this is where Murray gets really passionate, I bet.
Oh, yeah. He's a huge Churchill defender. And he goes all in on, like, praising Churchill's role in standing up to Nazi Germany.
Makes sense. I mean, Churchill is seen as, like, a hero by a lot of people.
Right. And Murray sees any attempt to, like, diminish Churchill's contribution as, like, fundamentally wrong.
Okay. But, I mean, no one's perfect, right? Not even Churchill.
And that's where Smith comes in. He acknowledges that, like, yeah, defeating Nazism was obviously hugely important.
Good.
But he also points to the, like, catastrophic consequences of the war, especially for Eastern Europe, which ended up under Soviet domination.
Right. So he's adding that nuance, saying that, like, even though the good guys won, there were still massive costs.
Exactly. Like, it wasn't a clean victory.
Yeah.
And they bring up this analogy with Lincoln, how he made some tough choices during the Civil War, and it's easy to judge him in hindsight.
That's a good point. It's easy to judge people from the past based on our current values and understanding.
Totally. And then they shift to talking about the impact of what they call the perpetual state of war since 9/11.
So they're talking about Iraq, Afghanistan, all that.
Right. And they focus on how the perceived lies that were used to justify those wars have eroded public trust.
Yeah, I mean, if you feel like you were lied to, you're going to be less trusting of the government and the media going forward.
Totally. And they're saying that this distrust has spilled over into how people view history as well.
Okay, so that's connecting it back to the earlier conversation about historical revisionism,
Exactly. And then they get into the Ukraine war.
which is like the current big thing, right?
Totally. And Murray immediately brings up this idea that online algorithms are actually favoring conspiratorial narratives about Ukraine.
Really. So like pro-Russia stuff is getting more visibility.
That's what he's saying. And he's
No.
concerned that it's downplaying the Ukrainian resistance and the extent of Russian aggression.
Yeah, that's a problem. Like if people aren't getting an accurate picture of what's happening, it's hard to like form an informed opinion.
Right. And then they get into this whole thing about corruption.
Oh, okay. Like
Yeah.
comparing Ukrainian corruption to Russian corruption.
Exactly. And Murray is basically saying, look, I'm not denying there's corruption in Ukraine, but can we talk about the massive corruption in Russia, especially given that they're the aggressor here?
So he's saying it's a matter of like perspective and proportionality.
Right. And then they get back to basics, what's the root cause of this war? And they're very clear. Russia invaded Ukraine.
Yeah, that's the bottom line.
And they even bring up Trump's comments about Zelensky supposedly starting the war.
Oh, wow. So they're using that as an example of like deflecting blame from Russia.
Exactly. But then they bring up the argument that Western policies, specifically NATO expansion, actually provoked Putin.
Okay, so this is the counter narrative. Like Russia was feeling threatened by NATO moving closer to its borders.
Right. And they reference this memo by William Burns, who's now the head of the CIA, and some statements by Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, about a potential treaty that was on the table.
So they're trying to show that like there was a diplomatic path that could have been pursued.
Exactly. But then they present the counter arguments, like Putin's stated reasons for the invasion were all about annexation and these false claims about Nazis in Ukraine.
Right. And like the reality on the ground is that Ukrainians are fighting for their lives, for their homes.
Exactly. And they emphasize that, in a liberal democracy, you're allowed to criticize your own government.
Of course, that's the whole point.
But they also point out that this can sometimes lead to a skewed perception of global issues.
Interesting. So like because we're so open to self-criticism, our flaws are more visible than, say, an authoritarian regime.
Right. And they call this Moynihan's rule.
Moynihan's rule, I'll have to look that up.
It's fascinating stuff. And then they move on to the Israel-Hamas conflict, starting with the immediate aftermath of the October 7th attacks.
So this is where things get really heavy again.
Oh, yeah. And what they focus on is the surprising amount of support that Hamas seemed to get in some circles.
Yeah, I mean, that was really shocking. How could anyone condone those attacks?
And Murray tries to unpack that. He links it to negative portrayals of Israel and also to underlying anti-Semitism.
So he's saying that some people were predisposed to excuse Hamas because of their pre-existing biases against Israel.
Exactly. And they even bring up the Believe All Women movement and how it seemed to fall apart when it came to the Israeli women who were assaulted during the Hamas attacks.
Oh, wow. So they're saying there was a double standard there.
That's what they're suggesting.
And that's a huge problem. If you only believe all women, when it fits your narrative, that's not really believing all women.
Exactly. Now, Smith is very clear that he condemns the attacks. He calls Hamas a death cult.
Okay. So he's not defending Hamas at all.
But he disagrees with the portrayal of the 2005 Israeli disengagement from Gaza as this big concession that gave Palestinians a state.
Right, right. That's a common talking point, but it's more complicated than that.
And the argument that's presented is that the disengagement was actually designed to kill the peace process.
So it's more about strategic maneuvering than genuine peacemaking.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have the blockade of Gaza.
Which has been devastating for the people living there.
Right. But the counter argument is that Hamas could have used that opportunity to build a peaceful society. Instead, they chose to stockpile weapons and, continue the conflict.
Okay, so that's the they brought it on themselves argument.
Right. And they even debate whether Gaza can be accurately described as a concentration camp, which is a really loaded term.
Yeah, it's a really sensitive comparison.
And they talk about the growing population in Gaza and how that plays into the whole
It's
situation.
like a pressure cooker, right?
And they discuss the economic impact of the blockade, which has obviously been huge.
Of course.
But they also acknowledge the Israeli rationale for it, which is to prevent weapons from getting into Gaza.
Yeah, that's the stated goal, at least.
Right. And then they lay out the goals of the Israeli operation: retrieving the hostages and destroying Hamas.
Okay, so those are the two main objectives.
But they also acknowledge how incredibly difficult those goals are to achieve.
I mean, how do you destroy an organization like Hamas? They're embedded in the population.
Right. And they bring up this point that the families of the hostages are often critical of the war itself.
Wow, that's interesting. You'd think they'd be the most supportive.
But it's more complicated than that. And they draw this comparison to asymmetrical warfare, like what Al-Qaeda did.
Oh, right. Like provoke a disproportionate response that ends up hurting the enemy more in the long run.
Exactly. And this leads to a really heavy discussion about civilian casualties in Gaza.
I mean, it's unavoidable in a war like that.
But they really get into the moral implications of it. They use this analogy of, what if we had to level a whole city to get to Kim Jong-un? Would that be justified?
That's a tough question. It's like weighing the lives of one person against the lives of many.
Right. And they disagree about whether destroying Hamas would actually solve anything. Would another group just pop up in its place?
Yeah, that's always the question with these things.
And they get into the intentionality of civilian deaths, whether Israel is deliberately targeting civilians.
Oh, that's a really sensitive topic.
And they use this analogy of blowing up a building to get one person inside.
It's a powerful image.
Right. But they also point out that there's documented evidence of Hamas using civilian infrastructure for military purposes.
Yeah, like schools and hospitals. It's horrific.
And they also claim that Hamas is booby-trapping buildings, which contributes to the devastation.
So it's like a really messy situation where both sides are contributing to the civilian suffering.
Exactly. And they acknowledge the immense human cost of the conflict on both sides.
But, I mean, the scale of the suffering in Gaza is just unimaginable.
Totally. And they bring up this concept of selective empathy, how some people seem to care more about certain victims than others.
Yeah, like depending on their political leanings.
Right. And they briefly touch on the long history of this conflict, how this isn't just about the recent events.
It's generations of conflict.
And they even make the argument that, in some ways, Hamas was forced upon the Palestinians because they didn't have any other options.
It's like a cycle of violence it's really hard to break out of.
Exactly. And they mention that there's actually internal dissent against Hamas within Gaza.
Okay, so it's not like all Palestinians support Hamas.
Right. And then they broaden the conversation to look at the U.S. role in all of this.
Okay.
And they use the Syrian civil war as an example where the U.S. wasn't really the main player.
So Russia and Iran were more involved in that conflict.
Right. And the argument is that, the U.S. often doesn't have the staying power or the, deep understanding to effectively intervene in the Middle East.
Yeah, that's a common critique of U.S. foreign policy.
And they talk about the consequences of the interventions in Iraq and Libya.
Both of which have been pretty disastrous in terms of stability and human suffering.
Right. And they even get into this debate about whether the intervention in Libya was actually a humanitarian mission or, part of a bigger plan for regime change.
Interesting. So they're questioning the motives behind that intervention.
Exactly. And they mention Wesley Clark's claims about a plan to topple a bunch of regimes in the Middle East.
Oh, wow. And the Clean Break Memo.
Right. Right. That's the one that advocated for a much more aggressive U.S. foreign policy.
So they're suggesting that there was a hidden agenda behind the Libya intervention.
And then they talk about the role of neoconservatives like Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl in shaping U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, they were big proponents of the Iraq War.
Right. And the hosts caution against, falling into conspiracy thinking.
So they're saying, be critical, but don't go too far down the rabbit hole.
Exactly. And they even compare it to, woke leftist tactics,
Okay, interesting comparison.
They specifically mention how there's this sensitivity around talking about people with Jewish names when you're discussing policy.
Like walking on eggshells, right?
Yeah, and they're pointing to how that can actually hinder honest conversations about these issues.
Totally. And then they wrap up by talking about the role of experts in all of this.
How do we balance the need for expert knowledge with the fact that, experts sometimes get things wrong?
That's a good question. Like, who do we trust?
And they acknowledge how, like, social media algorithms and sensationalism can really distort our understanding of these conflicts.
Like, we're getting bombarded with information, but it's not always accurate or helpful.
Right. And then they reaffirm their commitment to, like, having these difficult conversations, even with people they disagree with.
Which is like the whole point of a show like Joe Rogan.
Oh, yeah.
Right. It's a platform for diverse viewpoints.
Exactly. So there you have it. It was a lot to unpack.
No kidding. Like, just the sheer complexity of these conflicts is mind-boggling.
And we've barely scratched the surface.
Right. I mean, we've touched on the history, the motivations of the different actors, the human costs, but there's so much more to explore.
Exactly. And that's what we want you, the listener, to do. Like, don't take our word for it. Go out there, do your own research.
Exactly. Read different perspectives, challenge your own assumptions.
Think critically about how you're getting your information.
Yeah. Like, who are you trusting? What biases do they have?
And most importantly, how can you contribute to a more informed and nuanced understanding of these really important issues?
Because, like, these conflicts affect all of us.
They do.
And the more informed we are, the better equipped we'll be to engage in meaningful dialogue and maybe, just maybe, contribute to a more peaceful world.
That's the hope, right?
It's a long shot, but it's got to start somewhere.
It does. So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. And thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a wild ride.
It has. All right. Until next time.
Take care.